So, Mark, what exactly is New Historicism and how did people come up with it?
Well, Rohan, the literary theory New Historicism, which came about in the late 20th century, involves the interpretation of text in a manner similar to structuralism, which studies the language and structure of a literary work, but with a historical context. The label of New Historicism came from its adoption of a historicist sensibility, much as had occurred within historical scholarship in the 18th and 19th centuries, but coupled with the approach of the so-called New History. New Historicism is based on the idea that literature should be studied and interpreted within the context of both the history of the author and the history of the critic. New Historicism acknowledges that any criticism of a work is colored by the critic's beliefs, social status, and other factors. A new historicist looks at literature in a wider historical context, examining both how the writer's times affected the work and how the work reflects the writer's times, in turn recognizing that current cultural context that critics conclude. Many new historicists begin a critical reading of a novel by explaining themselves, their backgrounds, and their prejudices. Both the work and the reader are affected by everything that has influenced them. New Historicism thus represents a significant change from previous critical theories, like New Criticism, because its main focus is to look at many elements outside of the work instead of reading the text alone. New Historicist reminds us that it is treacherous to reconstruct the past as it really was, rather than as we have been conditioned by our own place and time to believe that it was. New historicists also believe that we interpret events as products of our time, and not that we can look at history objectively. The significant principle of New Historicist thinking emphasizes that ultimately there is no space in literature for effective resistance to authoritative social power. So, Mark, if I were a New Historicist critic looking to analyze literature, how would I go about it?
Well, Dina, while historical critics must take into account their own personal prejudices and beliefs when evaluating a text, it is also important for them to consider the author. Evaluating literature by using New Historicism allows the reader to answer two important questions: why the author wrote the novel, and how his or her environment shaped the main ideas. Authors always have a motive in writing any work. By examining the time period in which any author writes, we can understand how social, political, or economic issues may have influenced a piece of literature. For example, an author's dislike of a system or government may cause him or her to write a novel with a decidedly political context or tone. An author may write something criticizing religion based on something that is happening in the world. Only by understanding the historical context and its relation to the author can we understand the author's purpose. Now, this theory is not hard to apply to a piece of literature. One thing to look for is how any aspects of the work relate to what is happening in the world during the author's time period. Making such a connection can help readers better understand the focus of the author's writing. Then, a new historicist should attempt to discern how the author presents the topic, providing an insight into his or her opinions. The readers can then evaluate the text by taking into account any bias the author may have. In addition, the readers should consider authors' histories and backgrounds to understand how they formulated their opinions. Another thing for a critic to consider is the effectiveness of the author's writing. How effectively does it discuss an idea or theory? Finally, new historicist critics should connect the text to other works on a similar topic from the same time period to understand the work's true impact on a historical scale. The ideas and concepts of new historicism are especially applicable to a work such as Mark Twain's novel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn.
So, how did the author's Mark Twain background influence his writing style? So, Matt, Mark Twain's experiences living in a slave state and working as a riverboat pilot helped to shape his views and opinions on white Southern society and slavery. Twain was raised in Hannibal, Missouri, a port town on the Mississippi River. The town being on the river meant new vessels, new people, and ideas for the young Mark Twain. Twain's father was an attorney who shared an office building with the St. Joseph and Hannibal Railroad. This railroad This railroad was the largest and westernmost railroad until the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. The presence of this railroad meant yet another source of new people and ideas for the young Mark Twain. Twain, living in the slave state of Missouri, helped to mold his abolitionist abolition-like views as he was exposed to the practice of slavery early on. When Twain got older, he landed a job as a riverboat pilot on the Mississippi River, having him routinely travel from St. Louis to New Orleans. These travels up and down the Mississippi River, deep in the heart of the South, solidified his views on white society and the negativity of slavery. All these factors attributed to the molding of Twain's views, however, it was working as a riverboat pilot that provided Twain with the most influential experiences to form his writing. Working as a riverboat pilot in those days was a highly coveted position. When he was hired and began working, he learned how to identify landmarks up and down the river and identify currents. It was through this job he got his pen name, Mark Twain, as this was a call on the riverboat to measure depth in the river for the steamboat. Twain worked as a pilot on the river for a good while, even after his brother was killed working on the boat he piloted. This greatly affected Twain, as he was guilt-stricken and blamed himself for his brother's death for the rest of his life. Twain piloted the riverboat until the start of the Civil War in 1861, when all commercial traffic was suspended on the Mississippi. All these experiences helped Twain form inspiration for Huck Finn, as he traveled the same path Huck did and lived through very similar situations as Huck. So, Mark, there's been a lot of controversy about the use of the N-word in Huck Finn. Looking at the book of the angle of historicism, what role does the N-word play in the book?
Yes, Ethan, the debate of the N-word is a huge topic in the modern world, but after applying the new historicism theory to Huckleberry Finn, the rationale behind Mark Twain's vulgar diction becomes clearly relevant to the reader. In 1885, although slaves were freed, the treatment of African Americans was not the best because Jim Crow laws were in place in 1876, and the Reconstruction of the South had failed a year later, thus creating segregation and discrimination at its peak. Some examples of Jim Crow laws were segregation in public schools, public areas, and differing laws on intermarriage dependent on the state. At this time period, Mark Twain was serving as an advocate for the equal treatment of African Americans in the southern states, expressing his beliefs through satire. Twain was born in 1835, so he was alive when slavery was still present throughout the United States. He witnessed all of the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation where slaves were considered free in the South. Of all authors to talk about slavery and freed men, Mark Twain is one of the most trustworthy because he was alive throughout the whole process of slavery and the aftermath. Mark uses the voice of Jim in the book with the same voice of an enslaved person in the South. He uses Huck as a child that doesn't know why slaves are looked down upon, and he figures it out by himself. Which is why the use of the N-word in Huckleberry Finn gives a stronger meaning and places the reader into the period of time, instead of telling the story about that period of time.
So Mark Twain is known for being against slavery. How does he express his ideas about the world?
Well, Robert, Twain's main satirical subject in the novel, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, is the nature of how the black man is run, lowering society than the white man. Twain is satirizing how the southern society does not have the value of equality within their society. Twain is able to show the effect of the time period and the historical moments in his novel, and his belief that all men are created equal and should all be on the same social status. The fact that Twain lives in a free man and humanizes him throughout the book shows how Twain supports the ideology of abolitionism. By Twain writing this novel during the time of Southern customs and Jim Crow laws, he's trying to show how the Southern society used to reform the beliefs that blacks are independent and below whites in society. Also, he's trying to show how blacks are able to rise above the white traditional view that blacks are not able to benefit society. Since the American culture just underwent a split of belief in the conflict of slavery, Twain is trying to show humanity and we all need to come together. During this time period, black people were technically not slaves in society, but were still considered below whites and thought of as slaves. Twain's purpose of humanizing Jim was to try and raise black people out of the low class stature and validate that black people are equal to whites in society. Also, Twain's depiction of Jim's development throughout the book originates from the traditions of the time. The time period that Twain was writing was one period when black's identity and social status was unclear and murky. The equity theory of new historicism is able to show how Twain believes in the ideology of abolitionism that all blacks should be free and equal in society.
Mark Twain's abolitionist views, his use of the language of the time, and background and life story all played important roles in the novels.
Well, thank you, Mark, for coming in and sharing your analysis with us.
No problem, my pleasure.
What else?